All right, so today we are leaving Egypt and we're marching forward in time. In tracking the Chthonic or rock-cut architecture, this lecture will focus on the rise of the Persian Empire in present-day Iran and the post-Alexander Hellenistic world in present-day Turkey. Then the lecture continues in one of the most iconic rock-cut cities in Nabatean Petra. While still rock-cut and still Chthonic, this architecture takes on a different character from Egypt. While keeping strong relationships between the rock-cut work and death, the work matches the differing influences in different locations. Rock-cut tombs go from an elite privilege to an accessible monument in the Hellenistic world. The rock edifice then transforms into an entire city, a powerful stronghold, not just for the memorialization of those who have passed, but as an active crossroad for trade. This city generated wealth, and this wealth is displayed in its ornate carvings and in the buildings, the Chthonic architecture that we will examine. In a constantly changing political landscape, the rock-cut architecture we'll examine was the mark of permanence. Okay, just a side note, for those of you even thinking about majoring or minoring in art history, I just want to give you a brief overview that if you were going to major in art history, you would need to take 8 classes in the art department, 6 in art history and 2 in studio or the business of art. There are some amazing classes where students are selected to go to New York and pick out works of art that then become part of the Wake Forest collection. It is an amazing opportunity to go to some of the best galleries and to consider some of the very best art to become part of Wake's collection. As a minor, you would need 4 classes, 3 in art history and 1 in studio or the business of art, and you are also eligible to sign up for that trip. If you have any questions on this, let me know. I will have an update in the next week as to all of the fantastic careers that one can pursue after a major in art history. And spoiler alert, they are not just in art history and museums. Okay. Today's class objectives will be on the track of a continued study of Chthonic architecture. We will be looking at largely igneous formations on the Iranian plateau. The architecture we'll look at is Darius's tomb, Petra, and so briefly we'll take a quick look at the amazing churches of Cappadocia. As we saw yesterday, the Chthonic is global in scope. Today we are focusing on Turkey and the Arabian Peninsula. Just to get an idea of the landscape here, we are in a region that is largely a flat desert. The Iranian plateau is a geological formation in Western and Central Asia. It's part of the Eurasian plate, wedged between the Arabian and Indian plates, situated between the Zagros Mountains to the west, the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus Mountains in the north, with the Persian Gulf to the south and the Indus River to the east. This gives you the geology of the region and sets us up for what we will see as the tectonic collisions between plates and extrusions of igneous rock meet with Chthonic architectural innovation. Here's another map just giving us the political lay of the land. You can see, of course, we are looking at Iran to start, and it is bordered on its western side by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There are rippled mountains through this region, and the mountains really swirl like fabric if you started to look at them as layers and folds in the plates themselves. And the architecture we're looking at really adapts to the landscape, moving from the river plains up to the mountain ridges. We are in the setting of the Archimedean Persian Empire. In 500 BCE, Cyrus the Great united the Persian Empire. The empire was notable for embracing various civilizations, including those that it conquered, into its fold, allowing people to continue their religious practices, their cultural practices, and bringing them into an economic and political union. The region we're looking at spans at its maximum extent from the Balkans and Eastern Europe proper in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. At one point, this empire expanded over 8 million square miles and included Pharaonic Egypt, where the people there would have come in close contact with the Chthonic architecture of the pharaohs. So let's go straight to Persepolis. The ruins of Persepolis lay at the feet of the Ku-i-Ramat, or Mountain of Mercy, in the plain of Mardashat, 400 miles from the current Iranian capital of Tehran. This extraordinary city, founded by the ruler Darius, marks out a significantly different type of tomb architecture than what we saw in Egypt, or even in the ziggurats, which were more common in the region, that we'll look at later in the class. In Persepolis, the Chthonic impulse deepens as tombs or burial architecture and natural mountainous landscapes merge once more. Zooming in, within these ribbled mountains, as the topography shows, the entire folded region from Anatolia to the Hindu Kush Mountains that define the edge of Afghanistan and Pakistan was a fertile mountainous region that was generally easily navigable, with lots of opportunities for rest stops for long-distance travelers of the ancient period. This is actually at the edge of a fertile river system, the Tigris and Euphrates, which we just examined, and it's an intermediate zone before the ecology changes to completely arid and dry deserts as we recognize on the Arabian Peninsula. Persepolis, in the midst of this folded mountain area, it was a majestic Persian city, elevated on a platform and pushed into the hillside, actually carved in many ways out of the hillside. It was widely accepted that work on the terrace, what we're looking at here in the left of the image, where you can see the remainder of the footprint of the buildings in this monumental city. It's thought that these were began in 518 BC, although the palace wasn't completed until an entire century later, during the lifetime and reign of Darius' successor, Xerxes. Okay, take a minute to identify what we're seeing here. You guys have done a wonderful job of identifying these things in class. We are beginning to see more clearly over time what's happening when we look at plans. Here we know we have a series of highly columned spaces. A highly columned building or building with multiple columns, as we see in the Apadana of Darius on the left, or the Hall of 100 Columns, which really just spells out for you what's going on in there. We see in these, this is called a hypostyle building, when it's supported by a span of columns all the way from top to bottom, left to right. And we have hypostyles on steroids in this plan. Here, we're now looking at an axonometric plan. You're not going to need to identify this, but just for your own knowledge. An axonometric plan looks at the object of study on an axis, as if we were above at a height, looking down in a way that we can see both the footprint of the building and part of its elevation. You can see what I'm talking about when you look at this plan, right? It's not a head-on elevation. It's not a direct look from above as we would see in a plan. It's an axonometric view. Several things come up. Now we see in greater detail what the buildings would have looked like in the Hall of 100 Columns in those different hypostyle buildings. And we see this crazy wall that lines the city. It was made of mud brick. It was over 30 feet thick. 30 feet thick. It's a massive mattress. Excuse me. Massive fortress-like construction. So Persepolis is a city that takes advantage of the rising elevation to gain a prominent position over the lower plains. It's not on the flat plains, it's not up in the mountains behind it, it's up on a carved out plateau in the hilly region. This permitted a great view in terms of strategic outlook, and given that the city was largely a spot of tribute and cultural exchange, it allowed the ruler inside to see those who were coming from miles off. It was principally a city of religious and cultural tolerance. Again, the Persian Empire permitted the customs and cultures of the people they conquered to continue. This is a key idea that comes up in so many of the ancient civilizations. In order to thrive and grow, they valued the different long-standing cultures that they were encountering, that they were conquering, sometimes that they were colonizing, of course, but they didn't force them to change to their own religion. They didn't force them to change to any strict systems of belief. They had to pay tribute, and that was allegiance enough. So here we are looking at the remains of the Apadana, or the audience hall, which is a staple of Archimedean structures. It's comprised of a columned hall with corner towers and external colonnades. The style of building, which we've been describing for the last couple of slides here, again, it's a hypostyle, or a multi-column building that's characterized by the roof being supported by a series of columns. The Apadana has open column verandas on 3 sides. Additionally, we'll look at the carved stone reliefs, chariots, figural animals, and towering slender columns and gates that point to the city's former splendor. You can see some of them here in this image with this spectacular bowl shape over here on the left. It's almost a merging of a bird's beak and a horse or a bull's body and those large claws that we see at the foot. And take a look at those columns. Like those of Greece and Rome, but they're elongated vertically, spectacularly elongated to heights we wouldn't have seen in the Greco-Roman region. These columns in the city were likely inspiration for Ashoka's Pataliputra, the capital of the Mauryan Empire in India, and also for Ashoka's stone pillars built around the 4th century BCE. And the Sphinx, the large statues from Syria, we see they're beginning their inspiration here. This is a reconstruction of how the Apadana that we were just viewing would have looked when it was completed. You see these spectacular columns with incredibly elaborate capitals. If you look at the capitals on top of the fluted columns, particularly on the right, you see some characteristic double bowl structures at the very top. We'll take a closer view at those in a minute. But you could just imagine the majesty, the awe that this sort of building would have inspired in those who were coming to pay tribute, to pay tax, to confirm their loyalty to the leader of the Persian Empire. Here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like in color. A theme throughout the class is the way that the things we see now as classical, stoic, unpainted definitely were not. Cultures of the past, just like cultures of the present, love color. So again, here we are back at the Apadana, and it was here that the king received tribute from the tributary nations under Archimedean rule. And you can see this through an acting out of that tribute payment. We see the figures here in the bottom right marching toward the king, marching toward the Apadana, followed by symbols of the Archimedean Empire, the bull and the lion on the left. Here's another spot where a tribute and the tributaries were carved in bas-relief. And those stairs that we just examined moved one toward or away from the Gate of Nations that we're seeing here. This gate acted as an entrance to the Apadana and the throne hall. The entrance to the gate is guarded by more bulls. And for context, the bulls are so present in Persepolis because they play an important part in Nowruz, the Persian New Year at the spring equinox. The bulls represent the moon, and they're typically juxtaposed by a lion who personifies the sun. The Persian New Year is relevant because it's the day that tributary nations presented their tributes to the king, which also leads some to suggest that the reason Persepolis was created in the first place was specifically for this New Year celebration. What you can't see from this view, you can see in more detail from the next slide. This is a monumental gate. If you look at the people at the bottom, they barely come up from the footing or the base of this spectacular architectonic structure. And you can see the columns looming in height behind them. So we're moving away now from Persepolis over here on the right with that black pointed arrow headed to the plain where it had been, or the plateau where it had been carved out and constructed, shifting over to the point at the left of the side, Nashki Rastam, where we will focus more of our examination. Rastam is located just to the north of Persepolis at the base of the Antar Ridge of limestone. The sepulchres, or tomb chambers, that we'll examine there are hewn out of the rock in the hillside. The facades that we'll see, one of which is incomplete, are richly decorated with reliefs, and they mimic the palaces of Persepolis. The modern Persians call this place Nash-i-Rastam for the later Sassanid or Neo-Persian Empire reliefs beneath their openings, which they take to be a representation of the mythical hero Rastam. Another view of as we're zeroing in, and these are the spectacular tombs where the leaders of Persepolis, the leaders of the Persian Empire, of the Achaemenid Empire, were buried. The facades of the tomb almost look like writing on the side of this cliff. Darius the Great, the fourth Persian king of the Achaemenid Empire, was the first to choose this site as his burial ground. And his successors not only imitated this idea of a cliffside tomb, but they also copied the layout of his tomb exactly. This is a theme that we saw in Egypt. It's a theme that we see in contemporary culture. Someone comes up with a great idea, and there are copycat successors, those who take inspiration from that first idea again and again. So we can see here in this image that there are 3 tombs carved directly into the face of the mountain, along with other carved and freestanding elements, particularly this tower to the left out in front. And there's a 4th tomb that you can see off in the distance. Here you can see a bit more of the topography of where these hillside burial spots are located. So back to this image, what's going on here? We haven't seen anything quite like this yet. What were the Persians, the Achaemenians, trying to convey with this type of architecture, this form of Chthonic architecture? First, the tombs take place in geology, communicating this idea of permanence through death, like we saw in Egypt. They're similar to the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, but the geology creates a completely different setting. The very vertical rock face, similar perhaps to Abu Simbel, becomes the carved face of the tomb. Here, no one is trying to hide the presence of the tomb, as one had to hide the entrances into the pyramids and into Abu Simbel to make sure that they wouldn't be looted. Here, these carvings become like billboards, trying to draw attention directly to the tombs. Take a second and just look at what's happening here. These carved facades literally become faces of the side of this cliff, this mountainside. And yet, as they are becoming part of nature, as they are taking on this idea of permanence through geology, there's also an incredibly rectilinear geometry being created here, a very man-made mark inside of this natural cliffside. The flat surfaces, the rectangular corners seem to suggest a connection between quarrying stone that would have been required for the freestanding buildings in Persepolis. In that sense, these tombs highlight that the stone that is left behind here. The shaping of the native stone now takes on the significance of the excavated stone. Each tomb is composed in a similar way. Each facade is composed in a similar way. First, with a central rectangular carving that mimics the buildings of Persepolis, right? We have these tall, high columned areas that look much like the Abadana. We could imagine that if we walked inside that door, we would see a hypostyle or a multi-columned room. The columns are repetitively spaced. There's an entablature above. We've got this post and lintel idea being formulated. Up above that, there is a bas-relief depicting a royal narrative. And then below this central panel, nothing. No carving, no bas-relief. Archaeological work has shown that there was never more than a plain face there. So we've got this biaxial symmetry, this cross-like shape that is mimicking architectonic structures. We have things set up as columns, and we know those columns aren't doing the work of columns, right? They aren't supporting anything above. They're just a decorative carving. It's the way that architecture, that ideas of the architectonic exist even in Chthonic architecture. Here's a close-up again of one of those bowl-topped columns that are so endemic to Persepolis that they are often called the columns of Persepolis. Whenever you see this sort of style, and we see a rendering that completes that story up above the tomb itself. In the top panel above the facade is a relief depicting the king standing on a 3-stepped pedestal in front of an altar. His hand is raised in a gesture of worship. Above him floats a winged disc of Ahurmazd, the god of the Zoroastrian religion. The scene is supported by throne bearers representing the 28 nations of the empire. On the side panels are the king's weapon bearers and the Persian guards, and the inscriptions either enumerate the 28 nations upholding the throne or they glorify the king and his rule. Sort of standard procedure for celebrating one who has passed, celebrating a strong ruler who is. Here, when you look at all three of them, you can see that narrative gesture is repeated at the top of this biaxial facade, and again, there's nothing on the bottom. Any guesses at why that's the case? Part of it has to do with perspective when standing from below. If there had been carving, if there had been a multi-dimensional facade on that bottom part of this cross-like shape, it would have obscured viewing up. It would have been harder to see up to the tomb. By carving it out, by quarrying out that stone, it gave viewers at the bottom, standing on that little path that we see now, or just standing at the base of this cliff, a better view upward. But when we look at these three just standing here into the hillside, hovering here, they're kind of like an X marks the spot on the rock facade. And the Persians thought of them as a vault of eternity hewn into the central body of the rock. Almost as if the rulers buried within were suspended in midair. All right, here we are looking at a plan and a section of the tomb structure within. At the very top in the section, you can see that the tombs had vaulted ceilings, the way they rise up to a point, that's called a vaulted ceiling. And in the plan below, we can see that there was space for more than one person, that the family itself would continue to be buried there with Darius or with Xerxes or whoever came next and was buried in this fashion. I love this image. You can see the scale of the doors coming in and also just the precision of that very cleanly carved entrance. Here's a view into one of the tombs. And what we notice is it doesn't carry on the tectonic architecture of Persepolis. Here we have a more thoroughly chthonic vibe, right? This is a bearing within. Most likely, the ceiling and the walls would have been heavily adorned. Would have been either muralized, or there would have been carvings, things that just we can't see there anymore. So the only tomb that has been identified beyond a doubt is Darius I. The three other tombs have been attributed to his immediate successors, Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and possibly Darius II. The tombs are surrounded by several rock-cut bas-reliefs. And again, a bas-relief is like a partial sculpture that extrudes or that stands out from the rock, that is not removed in the carving away. These carvings made directly into the rock face usually depicted battles and conquests. Again, they are themselves billboards of an idea that this site is a display. They reinforce the idea that this site is a display or a show, a place where eternal glory was ensured through inscription in and on the mountain rock. But these people of extreme power were not the only ones to create burials, create their resting place in the side of a rock. There are other smaller tombs that dot the Persian landscape and point to this as a tradition carried out from the very height of society to the everyday people. We see here more and more evidence of that. And throughout this region, there are more and more evidences of these cliffside burial sites. All right, let's move on to Petra. If you have ever seen an image of Chthonic architecture, it's probably of Petra. Petra, the name, comes from the Greek word for rock. Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, a kingdom based on luxury trade. It was inhabited since prehistoric times, and it was largely a caravan city, situated between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea, as an important crossroads between Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, Phoenicia. Petra is only half built. It's half carved into the rock, and it's surrounded by mountains riddled with passages and gorges. It's one of the world's most famous archaeological sites where ancient Eastern traditions blend with Hellenistic or Greco-Roman culture and architecture. The Nabatean people filled a power vacuum in the Middle East, one left by the decline of the Greeks and later to be filled by the expanding Roman Empire. The Romans took control of Petra in 106 CE and rerouted trade away from the area. They were zeroing in. Once again, you can see Petra is located in this highly textured geological area. And then as we swoop into those steep canyons, you have this spectacular red stone, incredible texture, both in a close-up of that stonework and the way that it is layered and compiled, and then that far-off view of the rugged mountains, of their different shapes and forms. And in the midst of this very rugged landscape, we have a robust city, the city of Petra. Command of trade and of water enabled Petra to emerge as a center of Nabatean populations. They were formerly largely nomadic, but it seems possibly quite sophisticated. It's a great example of how those two are not mutually exclusive. Questions remain how a group of people living in a village of tents, however, created this magnificent city of stone. The map of Petra shows sites nestled within the canyons. The city is flanked by two outlying caravan staging posts to the north and the south, respectively. A series of sites built within and around the canyons is basically what we're looking at. And then you have this view. Is there anything more amazing? I'm not sure. The city of Petra, the site of Petra, was accessed through the Seek, massive canyon that our photographer here is standing within. The rock cliffs on each side are 250 feet high, and they channel the visitor into the city. In the early days, you would have to pay a toll to move through the Seek, and the same is true today if you come as a tourist. Once you've moved through the Sikh, you are approaching the monumental treasury that we see here. I love this because you can see how tiny the people look compared to this massive, massive structure. It's twice the height of Mount Rushmore. It was originally called the Khazne el Pharaon, or the Treasury of the Pharaoh, and it's an imposing standing facade that's about 40 meters tall, about 40 yards, or 120 feet, which would be something like a 12-story building, cut directly from the rock of the mountainside. On the lower floor is a portico with 6 columns, crowned by floral capitals, and surmounted by a fount. The third floor is divided into 3 parts at the center, and at the center is a tholus with a canonical roof. This tholus, that rounded column space, is surmounted by an urn, and on either side there are half frontons supported by capitals. This architectural and sculptural decoration was of the very highest quality, as you can see from what remains today. It is unique to Petra, the split tripartite facade that we see on that upper floor. It's just a marvel to look at. Behind the impressive facade, a large square room has been carved out of the rock of the cliff. This is typical of the tombs in Petra, as the interiors are plain, even as the exteriors are wildly intricate. What do you see when you look at this plan? What does it remind you of? What type of plan are we looking at here? In so many ways, it looks not unlike what we saw at Hatshepsut's tomb or mortuary temple in Egypt, right? We have this very tiny space at the back where one might have seen the highly sophisticated, highly guarded burial chamber of the pharaoh in Egypt, or here, the ruler of Petra. But there are no tomb inscriptions or grave crypts that have yet to be discovered. Other people consider this perhaps a treasury or a tax house for passing camel caravans. As they came through the Sikh, this might be the place where they paid their tribute and then moved forward. But many archaeologists and historians now doubt that many camel caravans came into Petra, as most of the caravans passed the city, traveling on the King's Highway, which was a good number of miles away. And so while most visitors are caught up with the majesty of the facade of this building, many are disappointed when they enter the treasury and discover a very huge, simple cubicle space cut out of solid rock. We know from the plan that something else was going on here. It doesn't have, if it was a storage spot, we would see lots and lots of small chambers rather than these 3 large spaces. It's still up for grabs what this space was, but what we know from other architectural plans, it's highly likely that this was a burial spot for someone very important. Looking back out at the facade, the magnificent sculptures that would have been at the base were destroyed by looters, and we know this from detailed drawings from many sources, both Greek and Roman. You see the marks along the side of the building that are still within that sharp rock cut boundary? Many people thought for a while that this was scaffolding used to build and carve the facade itself, but it seems now actually it might have been from looters. Further through the passageways of Petra, the entire city emerges. Roadways pass through, here an amphitheater, and along the way we'll see other burial sites, other homes, other spectacular monuments. Take a minute to think about this amphitheater. It really gives you an image of the life of Petra. There was so much going on here. so much life. Performance, we can imagine theater performances, we can imagine comedy, we can imagine all sorts of things in this space. And looking at how many seats, how many levels there are, it would have drawn a large crowd. It is Greco-Roman in origin. This type of amphitheater was first found in Greece and Rome, and the way it is carved, the angle at which it is carved would amplify the voice of the speaker below. Here we see it again, camels passing for scale. At its peak, Petra was a very large city, housing approximately 20 to 30,000 people, and they would have lived in a combination of rock-cut and freestanding spaces. The whole thing was approximately the size of Manhattan. And as we will see in detail, as you will see in that video that I'll post along with this, the architecture of Petra draws from Rome, Persia, Lycia, and Egypt. Within the rock-cut city, tombs still played a predominant role. As you can see here, the tombs are still within the rock, and yet they are part of the passing city life. People on foot would have seen these day in and day out, keeping those who had passed present in the life of the city. We know that these are tombs because the Aramaic inscriptions there identify them as tombs. And you can see that they're everywhere in the city. Petra holds over 800 different tombs of various composition and detail. In some ways, it was a necropolis living in a thriving city. Here's a view further out of those royal tombs. You can see the way the sandstone here, the striations in the rock really become a decorative swirling pattern that meant no other painting, mural, carving work was really needed to add to the magnificence of these spaces. For example, here at the top, you can see the remains of a series of 4 obelisks. This would have pointed toward an Egyptian cultural influence, while at the bottom we see a more traditional Greco-Roman style set of pillars that have faded with time. Moving back to this image at the top, you can see that stair step, or what's known as a crow step, at the top. Here's further detail of it. It's really a signature of the tombs in Petra, but it was used in different ways in the architecture we find there. Here's a really fantastic and clear example at the Uneshu tomb. This unfinished tomb demonstrates how these structures were carved from the top. It's counterintuitive. Why would they be carved from the top? This monastery is very similar to the treasury that we saw as you first come through the Sikh, but it's much larger. So it is actually 50 meters high and 45 meters wide, and it's much less decorated. The facade is flattened on the lower half, and the engaged columns and pediments you can see are flush up against the surface. Another story of Petra is really the story of water. To support the large population there, Petra had to provide an immense amount of water, and they did this by cutting through the rock, creating these elegant rock channels. The one that we're looking at here is part of a canal system that drew from over 1 mile away in Wadi Musa. You can see a map here of how far the water would have traveled to support the city of Petra. The channels connected natural spring locations with a series of tanks, creating a citywide water supply. Again, not something we think about this time and era of history. So what it means is that the Nabateans designed a pipeline to carry that water without generating too much pressure within the structure itself. We see at the top of this image the ceramic pipeline that they created to move water across these miles of space. And to optimize the flow of the water, they set that pipe carefully at a 4-degree slope so that it would deliver water at the right pace without overflowing the tanks and cisterns that would hold them. Definitely watch the video on this. It's pretty spectacular. The Nabateans had so much command of water that they were able to put water on display. And just think about that in this harsh climate. It was really a symbol of their power and control over nature, their skill as engineers, and their ability to really thrive in the harsh desert climate where Petra was built. If you have the opportunity, visit Petra. It's a remarkable manifestation of Chthonic architecture. All right, we're gonna fly through this last one of Cappadocia. We're moving to Turkey now. And here we are in the district of the Nevşehir province in Turkey. After the eruption of a volcano about 2.6 million years ago, ash and lava formed soft rocks in the Cappadocia region. And they covered about 20,000 square miles, this rock formation. The softer rock was eroded by wind and water, leaving the hard cap rocks on top of pillars, forming what today are called fairy chimneys. And you can see why. It looks like a fairy tale structure. Here's a little more detail of some of the many spaces carved into these soft rock formations. Some of these were burial sites, but a lot of them were used by monks for contemplation. And as you look at this outer space, it seems like outer space, but as you look at these exterior spaces, they seem rugged, they seem simple, but just wait until you see what's inside. Inside those small rock-cut openings are these magnificent chapel, temple structures and spaces. Highly ornate mural work. You see this recreation of a colonnade, and it's important just before we finish this section on Chthonic architecture to remember that none of these things are structural. The mountain itself is being held up by the rocks surrounding these sites of excavation. Those columns could be there or not be there. Of course, certain spans had to be managed to make sure that there wasn't too much weight above, even as we saw in the human-made mountains of the pyramids in Egypt. But what was done inside is just absolutely spectacular. All right, that's all we have today on Chthonic architecture. Thanks for paying attention. Be sure to watch the videos, and I'll talk to you soon.